The brand new RTX 4090 is here, and to test out whether it's actually any good, we're going to be building the ultimate gaming PC that you can put together right now. But is the humble new 4090 actually worth considering over something like a 3090 Ti, or instead have Nvidia drop the ball? Let's find out. Ebuyer.com are your one-stop shop for all things tech and gaming for my UK viewers. From a CPU upgrade to a new gaming monitor, they've certainly got you covered. And with a range of RTX 4090s on their site and a vast array of RTX 3000 deals available, why not bag yourself a new GPU today? Plus, their top-tier in-house system builder AlphaSync can get you gaming in no time, with free next-day delivery on a wide range of systems. Learn more at the first links in the description below. Let's start off by taking a sneaky preview at the 4090. With over 16,500 CUDA cores, a clock speed of 2.5 GHz, more than 50% faster than the 3090 and 90 Ti, this thing in theory means business. I've also heard rumours that it's pretty massive. Here we go. Oh my goodness me, Nvidia, what have you done? At first glance, it's huge, and at first pickup, it's like a two-handed pickup. That is so heavy. Let's have a look, shall we, compared to last gen. Admittedly, this is a 3080 Ti, so it's not 100% representative, but the 3090 wasn't way bigger. Look at the size difference. And if you thought, oh, well, it's just a bit wider, just a bit taller, look at the chunkiness on the new card. Look at that. 3 slots versus 2. The new graphics card's huge. I would argue as well, it's probably about twice the weight of our old 3090, which is unreal. I mean, obviously the Ada Lovelace chip in this, which is the architecture of 4000 series, is running very quick, which is going to put out quite a bit of heat, but it's also quite heavy in terms of power consumption and energy. At 450 watts, I believe this Founders card is, but a few birdies on a few trees far away tell me that the AIB cards from MSI Asus Gigabyte could be like 500, 550 plus watts. Of course, there will be cheaper cards coming soon too. The 4080 is going to come in 2 variants, a 16 gigabyte and a 12 gigabyte model. How restrictive the 12 gig model will be is yet to be determined, and I think we're going to take a look at that later in the year towards November time. Will Nvidia release 4070, 4060 cards? Probably at some point. They're not even discontinuing the 3080, which either shows how much stock they have of the 3080 left, or potentially as well how much cheaper that is as an option when compared to the 4080. But today's video is not about that. It's about the 4090 and seeing if it's actually any good. Now, of course, a new GPU has a few challenges. It's very heavy, it's very large, and it needs a lot of power, both in terms of our power supplies we talked about earlier, but also in terms of the rest of the components. And there could only, at the moment at least, be one CPU to fulfill that criteria. For the next few days, that's definitely going to be an AMD Ryzen 7000 Ryzen 9 chip. But that could change in about a week's time when Intel debut the performance of their 13900K and 900KS. For Ryzen, you've got 2 options, 7950X or 7900X. Of course, the more expensive chip gives you a bit more performance, but in this video, we'll be using the 7900X, a very, very strong chip with loads of cores, loads of threads, awesome benchmarks. It tops the charts in terms of performance, very hot, very power hungry, but we can deal with those requirements later on. It's also got some of the best single threaded performance we've ever seen, with boost clock speeds and overclocks of up to 6 GHz, very possible indeed, something which should help our 4090. We've not had this situation for so long, or if ever, where a new GPU, a new CPU launch at the same time. It's like a match made in heaven. Now, as with all our builds, we're going to build things as we go. We're going to next pop the CPU into the motherboard and start building out from there. The motherboard I've gone for is the MSI X670E Ace. Now, you might be thinking, James, just how do you go about picking the motherboard for a video like this? Well, we've actually tested in detail all of the latest X670E motherboards from AMD. Everything from Gigabyte to Asus to MSI, and we've done a full comparison. This comes out on top for us though with a 25-phase power design, dual USB-C front panel headers, of course PCIe 5 support, USB, Type-C, you've also got 10 gigabit Ethernet, awesome overclocking. This thing is the business, and MSI have done an awesome job, frankly, on their Ace motherboard. If there's one thing thing these new Ryzen processors do a really good job of, it's looking cool. I mean, take a look at the IHS design. Very, very clever indeed. We're going to be installing it into the socket on the motherboard. You want to locate the little triangle in the top left just up here and lift the arm of the socket cover upwards. Lift your top section towards yourself and then drop the processor in. Now, you've got to be very careful at this stage as these new socket on pin design can be very, very delicate. You do not want to damage or bend the pins on the socket itself. Give it a little bit of a double check, make sure it's seated properly, and if so, you can pop the cover down, add in the arm, and the black plastic protector will come off. Now then, with the CPU in, we can go ahead and pop the RAM and the SSD in to help complete a lot of the motherboard assembly. We've got some new RAM specifically designed for these new processors, which is not a vanity project, it's actually really important. This is the Corsair Vengeance RGB memory for AMD. This is their Expo kit. It basically gives you special overclocking and latency busting profiles that will really help in terms of performance. You can tell that this is the Expo kit because it's actually kind of a grey rather than a black, which is nice. It's good to have something a bit different, but I'm not going to lie, I would prefer an all black kit for our build aesthetic. But the only alternative with a G-Skill kit with no RGB, and that's not going to wash. If we take a look at our RAM DIMM slots just here, we're going to go ahead and pull back the clips on the second and fourth. These are each 16GB DIMMs, meaning we could add in another identical set for 64 gigs later, should we so desire. Apply a bit of pressure, they will both click in nice and easily. And with a rated speed of 6000 megahertz, you're sure to get some awesome bandwidth. Lovely stuff. I talked briefly about the SSD a second ago, but in detail, this is Seagate's FireCuda 530. With read and write speeds of 7GB on both, you're sure to avoid bottlenecking. Fast storage is really important for new GPUs, especially ones with as much power as the 4090. I feel like you can't say 4090 normally. From now on, until further notice, it's 4090 only. Now, this is a 2TB drive, which I think is going to be fine for our use case. Don't you hate it when this happens? You open your SSD and it's like floating at the bottom of the box. I think that's because we've not packaged it up properly after the last PC build. Fun fact, we reused components. Wow, secret has been revealed. I can't believe people actually think we use brand new components in every video. How much money do you think that I have? Clearly more than what I actually have got.
Got too much.
Too much. Got too much money. God, why have I said that? As I mentioned earlier, we're going to pop the SSD not to the right of the RAM DIMMs, but down here instead. We're going to open up our M.2 shield cover. Of course, you could go for a drive with a heatsink already built in, but to be honest with you, it's not really any point because you're going to ruin the aesthetics of the motherboard. You want to be able to see your lovely motherboard design, all the effort MSI have put in to make it look very nice indeed.
Where's that screw gone?
Also, MSI, I'm going to throw some shade, so get your umbrellas out. But look at this. They've put plastic in between, even on the IO shield here. There's plastic like between layers of motherboard that you can't get to. I spent ages, look, who puts plastic in there? And here, look here. See it? Why? Who would do that?
Especially on the bit that's going to get hot.
Yeah. MSI, if my PC starts melting, I'm giving you a call. Right, so what we're going to do is we're going to pop the M.2 drive into this top slot just here. You know, this is pretty easy. If you're building a 4090 PC, either you've done this before or you've got too much money. Got too much money. We're going to pop this in. Wrong way around. We're going to pop this in, make sure it's all lined up nicely. Add in our toolless mechanism to hold it into place. And then we can pop our M.2 Frozer shield back into place, not losing the screw this time around. And just like that, our motherboard assembly is essentially done. Just to go back to my previous point earlier about motherboards though, I mean, take a look at how much gear is on this board. 2 USB-Cs, 2 USB 3s, 2 USB 2s, 6 SATAs, 1, 2, 3, 4 M.2 slots. Wow. A crazy I.O., 25 power phases. I mean, it's basically got everything you could possibly want. And a massive backplate. Look at that, which I'm hoping, combined with our shielding for our GPU slot, is going to hold our 4090 in without causing too much damage. Now, of course, we need to install the motherboard into a case. And for a build like this, you actually haven't got that many options. The new 4090 is about 300 and... we measured it earlier, 350 millimeters. I'll pop the exact figure on your screen, but that means with a radiator at the front in a case, you actually haven't got that much clearance. Take, for example, like the Corsair iQ 4000 series. It's not going to fit. NZXT H7 lineup, it might do, but the new motherboards for AMD are all X670E and they're E80X, which don't fit. So you've got a few options. We'll link a few of our favorites below. In short, Corsair 5 and 7000 series, select NZXT H7s, depending on your motherboard. And of course, for this build, the Corsair Corsair iQ 5000T. Get subscribed if you want to see a 4090 build in the half 700 Evo. That is something I definitely want to be putting together at some point soon. For this stage, I'm going to gently move our 4090 out of the way. It'll be back later, so don't be turning off. Don't be going anywhere. I see you on that retention graph. Panic over. 4090 will be back. Now, the 5000T is a pretty apt and heavy case for this build because it's got loads and loads of RGBs. I think it's got like 300 individually addressable LEDs from the front fans to the strips at the top on both sides, the front on both sides, and on the bottom at both sides as well. Let me go ahead and get it unboxed, strip all the panels off and lay it flat on the table, and then we can go ahead and install the motherboard, followed by the CPU cooler, and then the 4090. I told you it'd be back. We may need to remove this cover. I'm not actually sure, so let's go ahead, take the board, and just gently find out, shall we? Let's lay it into the case, feed the I/O through. Yeah, we definitely got to take off that cover, which from memory is a little bit more difficult than I would prefer, but I think if we pick the case up, I believe there is a screw that we can access. I think it's here, and then a further one down the bottom, but give me a moment. With all the brain power at Corsair that exists, I'm sure they could spend a bit of time and make that toolless for the next iQ 5000T. I'm sure it's been a successful case they'll want to carry on to a new generation. And then, now with a bit more luck, we should just be able to gently slide the motherboard in. Always difficult to find points on the motherboard to grip. Slide that into place. There we are, over the center post. That now all appears to be seated exactly as we'd hope. So we're going to pop some screws in to make sure that's not going to go anywhere. Then we're going to add in the CPU cooler next up. For the cooler, I've picked up the Corsair H150i Elite LCD. With a customizable display, software control, and a 360mm radiator, it is perfect. Beware, you do need to go for a 360mm rad on these new CPUs. They run very warm, and having a poorer cooler is never going to end well. So we're going to pop that cooler onto the top, clip it over our pre-installed plastic brackets on the motherboard, and that's basically all we need to do. And with the radiator in, you guys know what's coming next. Let's bring the case round and go ahead and install the mother of all GPUs, the RTX 4090. Now, if we hover this over the slot, you can see... You can see how much of the case this is going to take up. Now, looking at the PCI lanes at the rear, there's two missing, but we're going to have to take out a third one as this thing is quite so large. So let's go ahead and do that first. It's got a thumb screw. The thumb screw is a bit too tight, so a screwdriver is the one for me. Let's take that out, remove the cover, push back the retention clip, and go ahead and install the mother of all Ada Lovelace GPUs. Here we go. In it goes. That's massive. It's a brick. Hopefully it doesn't perform like a brick. Hopefully it's also not bricked.
4090 brick.
I'd love to talk to you about the graphics card, but first I'm going to screw it in because I'm really worried that if I don't, we're going to have a few broken motherboards on our hands very quickly. So be right back. Now, of course, there is one more component left to go. We need to give our graphics card power. And for that, I've picked up the MSI AI 1300p. We'll come back to the performance of that in just a moment. But first, let's go ahead and get this installed. It's ATX 3 ready and PCI 5 ready, which are both very important when it comes to obviously getting this thing off the ground in the first instance. So let's go ahead and get this bad boy in. One of the main factors for choosing a power supply like this is obviously the wattage. Nvidia say that you only need an 850 watt unit or above. I'd be going for 1000 or above in my buying advice to you guys, especially if you've got a 200 watt TDP CPU or higher. That's 650 watts just in the CPU and the graphics card. That doesn't leave much else for all your other components, your basic motherboard power, any power that you need for any SATA accessories, coolers, hard drives, all of that good stuff. Plus you also want 20% headroom above and beyond what you're actually going to need to use. It does come included as well with that really small PCI 5 power cable. That's this one just here, which if we go ahead and install, it's going to pop in just there to power up the graphics card without any issues. And that's going to make sure we get all 600 watts the cable can provide, but 450 in the case of the Founders Edition, through a much slimmer, more attractive aesthetic, shall we say, than some of the other options out there on the market. And it's going to be a bit easier to run and cable manage as well. I'm going to go ahead and pop the power supply in, all our PSU cables and some nice cable extensions, and I'll meet you in just a moment for the benchmarks. But first, let's see if this PC actually boots up first time or whether all my handiwork was in vain. Right, so it's the next day. I've changed my t-shirt, I've plugged the PC up to a keyboard, a mouse and a monitor, finished our wiring, and in theory, I mean, there's no reason why this shouldn't now turn on first go. Hit the power button, nothing's happening so far. There was actually one cable I forgot to wire, which was the JFP1 front panel. We can do that later and use the power button on the motherboard instead to get this thing booted up. Okay, we've got some Fans spinning but no RGB. Coolers booting up, the RAM's on, top radiator's on. In theory, hopefully. Have we got an image to our monitor? That's the only other thing I haven't checked for yet. The monitor should now be powered on. Aha! It's booting into Windows. We've got a Windows drive in here, so that makes total sense as to why that would all be working. And our RGB fans are spinning. Would you just look at that? We can now go ahead and boot up a couple of games, starting things off with Cyberpunk to see how the thing performs. But first, it's time for an epic montage of just how sick our 4090 Founders build looks when it's all powered up.
Ladies and gentlemen, RTX 4090.
Started off with the brand new Cyberpunk 2077 update, and we first tested at 4K high settings with DLSS set to performance and RTX set to ultra. This is using the existing DLSS 2.0 tech. We managed to pull in 95 frames per second on average with 87 and 73 for the 90th and 99th percentiles. But of course, Cyberpunk is one of the only games so far to support DLSS 3. This enables a feature called frame generation, which uses AI to essentially fill in frames. And this pushed our frame rate to 144 frames per second on average. That gives us an improvement of more than 50% over DLSS 2.0 and gives us a frame rate uplift of 106 FPS more than with no DLSS enabled full stop. We did that run just as a bit of a reference, turning RTX on and DLSS off, and managed to get 38 frames per second. By no means a playable frame rate. Initially then, our results are good. But is the RTX 4090 hiding behind DLSS 3? Let's take a look at some of our other results to really find out. Moving on to F1 2022 next, we first tested with both ray tracing and DLSS disabled. At 4K on the ultra high preset, we pulled in 224 FPS. Not a bad start really. But what about if we enable ray tracing and turn on the last generation DLSS 2? Here, that drops our frame rate to 180, but considering the game is ray traced and looks a lot better, it's arguably a worthwhile sacrifice. But is it a sacrifice you really want to make? Well, moving up to 4K ultra high with ray tracing once again enabled, but this time DLSS 3 enabled, that adds Nvidia's new fancy frame generation tech, and our FPS jumps up to higher than our numbers with no ray tracing. 225 FPS to be specific. 90 and 99th percentiles were strong, and as always, we used both Nvidia FrameView and MSI Afterburner's Reaver Tuner to test our results. So just to clarify, turn DLSS 2 on and we get decent results, but DLSS 3 adds another 60 FPS, fully negating the performance hit of ray tracing. Very impressive. The good results carried on streaming through into the likes of Spiderman, where at 4K we tested at high settings with no DLSS, no ray tracing, and here we pulled in 143 frames per second on average. The game looked great, and once again, this gave us a very nice uplift over the last gen 3090 Ti, which achieved 109 frames per second, so we're seeing roughly a 30-35% performance jump, something which is very impressive. As with before, the results get particularly interesting when you enable the likes of DLSS and ray tracing, turn DLSS on, set to performance mode at 4K, and that'll push our frame rate up to 171 from 143 on average, while turning RTX on drops it down to 108. All of these numbers retained around a 30-35% uplift over the last gen 3090 Ti. Looking at Battlefield 2042 next, and here we tested at 4K high with DLSS enabled, and here we pulled in 144 frames per second on average. 90 and 99th percentiles were strong too, with 131 and 120. As a reference point, this was around about 45 FPS higher than the 3090 Ti from last generation, using the exact same DLSS 2.0 tech. Moving through into Apex Legends, and here our results get a bit more tasty, in a game which hasn't got that DLSS support. At 4K high, we managed to pull in 190 FPS. I mean, nearly 200 frames per second at 4K is crackers, and delivered around 30 FPS higher than our 3090 Ti. I think in this instance, the reason it's only around a 20% performance uplift is because of a CPU bottleneck. Despite using the fastest gaming CPU on the market, I don't think our processors can quite keep up with the power of this new 4090. 4090. Moving through into Valorant next up, and here we got a staggering 500 frames per second on average, 502 to be precise, delivering some absolutely ludicrous results. The 6950 XT for comparison was 50 frames lower, the 3090 Ti was 70 frames lower, and the 3090 was 100 frames lower. Obviously at this point you don't need these kind of frame rates, but it's good to see the cards stack up so well. Things get very interesting in Fortnite, where we tested our 1080p competitive preset just to get the maximum FPS, 325 on average, with everything tuned down to low except the render distance, which was set to far. This gives us an increase of around about 80 to 100 frames a second over the 3090 and 90 Ti respectively, and we got some great results here. Very, very playable indeed. We also tested out Call of Duty Warzone, a great reference point for any test. Here at 4K, high settings with DLSS once again set to performance, DLSS 2 in this instance, and we pulled in 202 frames per second on average. To give you an idea as to how this stacks up against some other cards on the market, it gives us a little less than double the 3090, it gives us around 80 more than the 3090 Ti, and gives us around 55 more than the 6950 XT. Really, really impressive numbers. You can't really ask for much more frame rate. We also tested a few easier to run and older titles for good measure. GTA 5 got 187 FPS at 4K high, and you can see just how well that stacks up against all the other cards on the market right now. Spoiler alert, stacks up very well. We also tested out LURA, which is a bit of a unique game, but this actually integrates DLSS 3, so it was quite a nice test. At 4K epic settings, we got 65 FPS, enabled DLSS 3, you jump up to 163. This was a game Nvidia recommended we tried, so obviously put what weight to that you will, but it is a great demonstration of DLSS 3. Someone said to me that enabling DLSS 3 is like hitting the 120 FPS and above button for any game, and it's a great way of explaining it really. Just for a few laughs, we also tested out Overwatch 2, of course the brand new Overwatch title. We all want to see how that stacks up. Spoiler alert, the 4090 is definitely ready for it. 456 FPS on average when testing with our Founders Edition RTX 4090. So then, what's my conclusion? Should you buy an RTX 4090? If you're looking for the best graphics card on the market, yes. There's not really much more to say than that. Does anybody need the performance of a 4090? Arguably no, but arguably no one ever needed the performance of the 3090 and the 3090 Ti, and people still bought those in their droves. In fact, they were out of stock for many, many months. We've reached a point now with graphics cards where, to be honest with you, with the current roster of games that are out, and of course more tricky, intense titles will follow, there's not really any modern high-end GPU that can't run them in a respectable way. If you want a game at 4K across the board and take advantage of DLSS 3, the 4090 is the card for you. Do you need one? Absolutely not. Nvidia have done a great job on this GPU, but they're sure going to charge you a pretty penny for the privilege.